Welcome viewers. Today in the second part of the theory of factor pricing, we will discuss the structure of the perfect competitive labor market, how wages are determined in this perfect competitive market, and how wages are determined in monopoly and monopsony, and how exploitation of labor will take place in the market. In the earlier part, we talked about the production function, the total amount of or various types of inputs, the type or nature of demand of the labor, that is it is derived demand and the demand of the inputs are interdependent, and then the most important concept of this marginal productivity theory and marginal revenue productivity. In marginal revenue productivity, we talked about how marginal revenue productivity is determined with the help of marginal revenue and the marginal productivity of labor. But that was the generalization. Now we will talk about how in competitive markets and imperfect competitive markets wages are determined. Factor pricing in a perfectly competitive goods and labor market. Assumptions: many firms, numerous workers. Workers do not need special skills. Wage taker behavior of the firm. Workers are free to move from one employer to another. So, just like in a product perfect competitive market, this is perfect competitive market for the labor. And as you can see that there are large number of sellers of the labor which are called employers, and there are large number of suppliers of the laborers. So, the supply is ample and the demand is ample, both the sides, and because of this these labors, they do not contain some specific skills, as it is written here, workers do not need special skills. So, the firm is having a wage taker behavior. Whatever wage is decided by the industry, the labor has to accept that wage, and workers are free to move. There is perfect mobility of factors of production or labor from one market to another market. Now, marginal revenue productivity in perfect competitive case. Now, since perfect competitive firms are price takers, so the output price remains unaffected by the firm's output, and therefore price equals marginal revenue. So, price of the firm or the product, it equals to marginal revenue product. Now, under perfect competition, because price is equal to marginal revenue, so value of marginal product is equal to price multiplied by marginal product of labor. So, efficient production requires that the ratio of the wage to marginal productivity of labor equals to marginal cost. And since this is profit maximization firm of the perfect competitive market, marginal revenue equals to marginal cost, that is W upon MPL equals to marginal revenue, or wage equal to marginal revenue into marginal productivity of labor equals to price into marginal productivity of labor. Now, here comes the question of price and the wages and the marginal revenue productivity of labor and how they are interrelated. So, as we can see that the ratio of wages and marginal productivity of labor should be equal to marginal cost of production of the firm. So, wages in the perfect competitive firm should be equal to marginal productivity of labor and marginal revenue, which in turn equals to marginal revenue productivity of labor or value of marginal productivity of labor. So, wages should be determined at the point where marginal productivity of labor equalizes the wages. Now, this table shows how with the various different units of labor total productivity is changing, and how with change in the total productivity marginal productivity is changing, and price of output in the fourth column shows that this is a perfect competitive market and that is why the price is given, and the last column shows, that is fifth column, marginal revenue productivity of labor, which is a product of marginal productivity of labor and price. Now, if we look at the table, first column gives us units of labor. One by one, as we can see that one unit of labor is employed, and with each extra unit of labor, total productivity is changing from 0 to 2000 to 3000 to 3500 and to 3800 and finally to 3900. And as we can see, the rate is slowing, that is diminishing, productivity is coming down. Why? Because labor is changing and capital is constant, and that is why the marginal productivity of labor is declining from 2000 to 1000. So, the last unit of labor is adding only 100 units of productivity to the output. Price of output, because it is a perfect competitive market, so it is given every time it is 222, nobody can change it, employer cannot change it. Marginal revenue of productivity, which is a product of given price and marginal productivity of labor, is coming down. The optimum quantity of labor to be hired in a perfect competitive market. The optimal rate of labor to be hired depends upon the wage rate. The MRPL is the labor demand function for the firm. When graph taking monetary unit on the vertical axis and rate of labor input on the horizontal axis, a downward sloping labor demand curve emerges. Now, what is the optimal amount of labor, or what is the optimal point in this market till which labor should be employed? As it is clear that value of marginal productivity of labor in this market is nothing but the demand curve for the labor. And just like any normal demand curve, product demand curve, when we take monetary unit of the labor on the vertical axis and units of labor on the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis, a downward sloping demand curve or a negative relationship comes out, as it is clear from the next graph. In this graph, we will show you the relationship between wage rate, marginal revenue productivity of labor and the units of labor. So, as it is visible that on the vertical axis, we are taking wage rate and marginal revenue productivity of labor, and on the horizontal axis, we are taking units of labor, and as it is very clearly visible that one by one units of labor is changing and increasing from 1 unit to 8 unit. And with that, marginal revenue productivity, that is the marginal revenue added by each unit of labor, is coming down, and this is because of the fixed machine and changing labor, or in shortened production function. So, now as you can see that wage rate in this market is given because it is a perfect competitive market, and as I told you that in perfect competitive market, wage rate is decided from the industry. So, wage rate is given at 200 level, and starting from MRPL $400, as you can see that with every unit demand of labor is coming down. This can be represented as at the very higher wages, employers, they are not willing to hire labor, and as wages are coming down, they are more willing to hire the labor because price of the labor is coming down. So, it is cheaper for them to hire more labor. Now, why A is the optimal point, that is where wage rate is 200 and units of labor is 5. Why it is said that this is the profit maximizing number of worker? Because this is the optimal employment. And why this is optimal employment? This is very clear that the labor should be hired till it is giving more marginal revenue to the firm. As soon as the marginal revenue starts declining, now the labor is no more productive. So, that is why the producer is not interested in hiring more labor. So, the equilibrium wage rate is the wage rate where MRPL equals to the price multiplied by the marginal revenue productivity of labor. Now, what is the hiring rule here? As it is clear, hiring rule can be explained with the help of 3 conditions. First condition, where marginal revenue productivity is greater than wage rate W. Firm should continue to hire more labor. Second condition, MRP equals to W. Firm should stop hiring more labor. And the third condition, where marginal revenue productivity is less than W. Firm should reduce the quantity of labor. Now, why this? Going back to the graph, when marginal revenue productivity here is more than wage rate, that means still the increased unit of labor is adding something to the output, and that increased output is providing revenue to the producer. So, that is why it is good to hire, it is profitable to hire more labor. This point where marginal revenue productivity is less than the wage rate is this, and if we extend this, we can see that marginal revenue productivity is less than market wage rate. That means producer, if now hire more labor, he has to pay more money to that labor. So, it is not cost effective for the producer to hire more labor. That is why the optimum amount or the optimal point is the A point, where wage rate is equal to marginal revenue productivity. So, this is the optimum wage rate in the perfect competitive market. Now, supply function. In perfect competition, no one buyer of the factor can influence the price of input, which means the input supply curve is perfectly elastic. Thus, the input price in an input market is constant. In contrast, for a monopolist or a single buyer of an input is upward sloping, additional inputs are available at higher prices only. Now, we talked about demand curve, but just like in a product market, there are two sides like demand and supply. Here again, in the labor markets, there are two sides, supply function and the demand function. We talked about demand function. Now, supply function in perfect competitive market, because the supply, individual firm cannot change the supply of the labor. So, supply is given. So, that is why the supply curve of the labor is perfectly elastic. A small change in the wage rate and there is more than proportionate change in the supply of the labor. This is highly elastic supply curve or perfectly elastic supply curve, which is not the case in the monopoly or any other imperfect competitive market. Why? Because additional inputs, additional labor, additional capital, all of these, they are available only at higher prices. If the employer wants to hire more wage, employer has to pay higher wages. Under imperfect competition, monopoly, individual demand curve is downward sloping. Marginal revenue curve lies below the demand function. Marginal revenue received from each extra unit of output sold is less than the price, because the firm has to lower the price to sell additional units. Now, after perfect competition, another side of the coin, that is imperfect market, and imperfect market is the most practical, more practical case than the perfect competitive market. And that individual demand curve in this market, imperfect market, it is downward sloping. Why it is downward sloping? Because to sell more product and to sell more or to invite more labor or to sell more product, the producer has to lower the price, otherwise nobody will buy the product. So, that is why it is downward sloping. So, marginal revenue curve lies below the demand function. So, there are two curves, demand function, demand curve and marginal revenue curve, and marginal revenue curve will always lie below the price curve or the demand function. These curves showing imperfect factor markets. As it is clear that on the vertical axis we are taking wages or the price of the factor of production, and on the horizontal axis we are taking labor. And as I already talked about that these are downward sloping curves. This is the marginal revenue curve of competitive market and this is the marginal revenue curve of monopoly, and this is the supply curve. Supply curve is positively sloping. That means with every increase in wages, supply of labor is increasing, and it is very natural also that because it is monopoly and markets are imperfect. So, if the monopolist wants to attract more labor, he has to increase the price, and because the supply is not elastic, then the wages will attract more and more labor. So, demand for labor is downward sloping and supply of labor is positively sloping. So, firm will hire where W is equal to marginal revenue productivity, but here because price is greater than MRP. What is price here? This is demand function, and demand function remains down, and this is the average revenue function. The upper one is the average revenue function, or which is also called as price. So, as we can see, the price of the product is higher, but marginal revenue product is lower. So, monopoly exploitation of labor is possible. That means a monopolist can charge higher prices and pay less to the labor because of market imperfections. So, he is charging higher prices for the product in the market, but he is paying less to the labor. Now, effects of monopsony in the factor market. Single buyer in the labor market faces upward sloping supply curve for the labor. Marginal cost of the factor lies above the supply curve. Firm equates marginal revenue productivity with the marginal cost of the factor, wage below value of marginal productivity, and monopsony exploitation of labor. Now, what is monopsony? Monopsony is another kind of imperfect market in which there is only single buyer of the input. That is, in the entire industry there is one single buyer which can buy that input, and that is why we say that there is single buyer in the labor market. And because there is single buyer, the entire control remains in his hand. So, with wages, the supply of the labor will also increase. So, that is why the supply function of the labor, it faces or it slopes upward. Marginal cost of the factor lies above the supply curve. Marginal cost, that is marginal cost of hiring the labor, it will remain, or on the other side we can say marginal cost or marginal expenditure. Expenditure done by the employer in hiring the labor will be more, and marginal supply of the curve is less. So, as it is clear that marginal cost of the factor lies above the supply curve. Firm equates marginal revenue productivity with the marginal cost of the factor. Just like in product market, here also the condition of equilibrium is that the demand function, that is the marginal revenue product function, and the marginal cost function should intersect at one point, and that point will be the equilibrium point. Now, I will show you the monopsony exploitation, how monopsony exploitation take place. Now, as again we can see that there are wage rate we are taking on the vertical axis, marginal revenue productivity, and labor on the horizontal axis. The variables are same, but the market structure is different. Now, this curve, which is again the downward sloping demand curve, which is equivalent to marginal revenue productivity, the curve is same for all the markets. Now, these two upward sloping curves are different in monopsony. This is the supply curve, which is again a simple upward sloping supply curve, saying that when wages goes up, more supplier would like to supply more of the labor in the market because he is getting more returns. The upper curve is the marginal cost of labor. Marginal cost is nothing but the expenditure incurred by the producer in hiring more labor. So, this is marginal expenditure or marginal cost curve. And as per the normal necessary condition of the market, the profit maximization point will be where marginal revenue curve equals marginal cost curve, that means this point. So, this is the point of profit maximization, but the actual prices or actual wages fixed are this, somewhere below this demand curve. So, as you can see that this gap between marginal revenue and wages is nothing but monopsony exploitation. Why monopsony exploitation? That this is the point where actually the price is determined and it's a profit maximization point, and actually the producer has to give this much of wages or payment to the labor, but because of the market conditions and because the suppliers are ready to supply laborers at this point, the wages are determined at this point. So, this is the wage determination point and this is the equilibrium point, profit maximization point, and this gap from this MRP, this point to W shows that there is exploitation. This graph represents the extent of exploitation in the imperfect market, that is monopsony. So, in monopsony and monopoly there is extent of exploitation is there. The supply of labor. Now, labor supply decisions determined by economic factors like wage rate and non-economic factors like demographic factors like age, education, gender and family structure, time allocation and leisure. So, the supply of the labor, just like demand of the labor is affected by a number of factors like price and technology, supply of the labor is also affected by the time allocation, the economic factors like price which the labor is getting and other factors like education, level of skills, family atmosphere, etc. Now, supply curve, the individual labor supply curve shows how the quantity of labor supplied by an individual depends on the individual's wage rate. A rise in the wage rate causes both an income and a substitution effect. The substitution effect of a higher wage rate induces longer work hours, other things equals, and the income effect is higher income leads to a higher demand for a leisure. Now, the supply curve, as I told you, there are various determinants, economic and non-economic. So, the wage rate actually checks about whether the effect will be the substitution effect or the income effect. Now, if the rising wages attract more wage earners and they work for longer hours for that earning that income, that is called as the substitution effect. And higher wages, they induces longer hours of work. Now, the workers would like to work more because they are getting more wages. But there are certain workers which want to enjoy that income whatever they are earning. So, if their wages are increasing, they want to enjoy with that amount of money also. So, that is why they will not work for longer hours. Now, as it is clear, again taking real wages on the vertical axis and hours of work supplied on the, that is labor supplied on the horizontal axis, and it is a positively sloped curve that as wages are increasing, work supplied is increasing, and this is a very normal behavior that when income or the wage earning is increasing, people are more willing to supply their work or their services. But there is another possibility where this supply curve is backward bending. That is, initially the supplier, the labor, they would like to supply their labor more with increasing income. But when they reach a certain point like this point, after this supply curve is taking and bending towards the vertical axis. Why this is so? That after a certain time period, now even after the wages are increasing, they are not attracting more labor. Why this happens? Because they are tired of work actually, and there is a limit to work. After that, they want to enjoy, they want to go for leisure. So, that is why it is backward bending. So, SS2 is the backward bending curve and SS1 is the normal positively sloped supply curve. And till now we talked about individual firms, individual economies, but for the whole economy, higher participation at higher wage rate and supply curve is upward sloping. So, usually whole economy participation of labor increases with the increase in the wage rate and supply curve is upward sloping, and people would like to supply more of their services when wages increase. And this is the overall industrial equilibrium of the labor market. As it is very clear, this is the rental rate or the wage rate, and this is the quantity of labor. This curve, downward sloping curve, is the market demand curve for the labor. This is the market supply curve for the labor. The downward sloping demand curve is showing that with the increase in wages or with the fall in wages, quantity of labor is increasing. On the other side, this positively sloped supply curve is showing that wages or the laborers, they are very much willing to and increase the supply of their labor with the increase in the wage rate, and they are intersecting at this point, and this point is called as equilibrium value of the marginal product of labor, and this is the equilibrium employment. So, you can say this is the ideal level of employment of labor where employers are happy, where laborers are happy, where everybody is happy, because this equilibrium level is giving maximum satisfaction to both the employers as well as to the laborers. Equilibrium factor market. The equilibrium price of the input in a competitive market arrives at a level where quantity supplied of labor equals to quantity demanded. So, in today's program, we talked about perfect market, imperfect market, how wages are determined in both the markets, how wages are determined in industry, how monopoly and monopsony exploitation takes place, and about the difference between the perfect and the imperfect wage determination and profit maximization. Thank you.